Hi, I'm Dr. James Miller. Welcome to Systematic Theology. For Christians, the Bible is the beginning point for our exploration of the knowledge of God. But the Bible is a collection of various genres of literature: history, parables, poetry, letters, prophecy, proverbs, and apocalyptic literature. Systematic theology intends to take this compilation of various sources and deduce a logical system that clarifies the nature of God, God's revelation to humanity, and the human condition. Systematic theology explores doctrines like creation and fall, justification and sanctification, the Trinity and the Incarnation. We'll look at how theologians have answered questions like, what is God? What does God want for humanity? Who is Jesus? And what can I hope for? It's a discipline that doesn't give us all the answers, but it improves the way we ask questions. If you've ever wanted to take all of your thoughts and ideas about God and try to put them together into a cohesive whole, this class is for you. So welcome to Systematic Theology. Hello class, this is Dr. Miller. Welcome to our studies in the Gospels. In this class, we'll look at the life and teachings of Jesus, the historical context in which he lived, and the ways his life and the Gospels have affected the history of the world. I've spent 25 years as a pastor and a professor, and I've talked to groups of people and individuals every week of all of those years about Jesus. In addition to that, the story of the Gospels have deeply impacted and shaped my own life. My deepest hope for this course is that the gospel message and the life of Jesus would impact and shape your life as well. If you need any help during this course, please reach out to me. Welcome to the Gospels. Hello class, today we're going to talk about the context of the Gospels. Jesus may be the Lord of all creation. We may think of him as a profound speaker and teacher whose words are timeless, but he emerged in a specific historical context. And that historical context shaped the kinds of things that he would talk about. I mean, you look at the differences between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the Apostle Paul, and you can see how their context shaped their very teachings. Paul's illustrations tend to be drawn from the life of a city. He uses urban metaphors. He talks about sailing and Olympic competitions. Jesus is primarily teaching in a rural context. So his parables, his stories, are about sheep and goats and all God's critters. The context of Jesus is speaking directly to farmers. And so he uses illustrations which would have been drawn from their lives. Paul is speaking to people in metropolitan areas. So he uses illustrations that would be drawn from their lives. That's a simple illustration of the effect of context, but the context of the Gospels is much broader than that. There are three specific historical contexts, historical groupings, which shape the narrative of the Gospels. And I want to look at all three of those today. The first context is the Hebrew context. Jesus was Jewish. And the Jewish people of the first century world were shaped by their belief system and by their history, which are intertwined. The belief system of the Jewish people we fortunately have a pretty thorough access to because it's contained in their scriptures. They believed in the teachings of the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly the Torah, the first 5 books of our Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The narrative of the Hebrews contained some broad themes that would shape the expectations of the Jewish people in the first century world. So for instance, the Jewish narrative begins with the story of Abraham. And God chooses Abraham from among all people to enter into a covenant with. God creates a covenant with Abraham. And in creating that covenant, the Jewish people would forever look back on Abraham and say, we are part of the chosen people because God chose him. He didn't earn God's favor, he was chosen by God. And so it was a matter of pride that the Jewish people said, we are children of Abraham. We are descendants of the one who was chosen. Therefore, we are chosen because we're in the bloodline that was chosen by God. Jesus enters into debates with the Jewish teachers of his day, and they sort of chide one another about being children of Abraham. And Jesus at one point says, you're not children of Abraham, you have Satan as your father. And their pride, their claim to fame is that they're descendants of the right bloodline. And Jesus challenges that and says, because you've rejected the heart of God, it doesn't matter that you're from that bloodline. So the story of the Hebrew narratives begins with Abraham. Genesis follows the 4 generations of that family line. And then the book of Exodus describes the time where God's people were in slavery in Egypt, and God called Moses to set them free. And although Exodus is the second book of the Bible, it is the center of the Hebrew Scriptures. It defines, more than any other book, the heart of the Jewish people. And God sets this up himself. When God begins the dictation of the 10 Commandments to Moses, he says, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the house of slavery, out of the land of Egypt. When God defines himself, he is defined as the God who set his people free. Who is God? What is God? The being that wants his chosen people to be free. And so the identity of God is wrapped up in the narrative of the Hebrew Scriptures, and in particular to certain key emphases within the Hebrew Scriptures. And the Exodus is premier among defining the themes of the Hebrew mindset. On top of that, Exodus contains some of the defining features of Hebrew worship. First, it contains the revelation of the 10 Commandments, of the law of God. When Jesus refers to the law, he's referring to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew canon. But the heart of the law is the 10 Commandments, given by God to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai as a revelation. This is God's will. This is God's law for the people. Now, the Torah contains over 600 different commandments, but the 10 are generally considered the center. The arrangement, the theological arrangement between God and humanity at that point is, if you are going to be my people, you will live according to my dictates. These are my laws for your life. Jesus in his lifetime ends up in debates with religious teachers because they strictly follow God's law. And they believe they are justified before God because they follow all the rules. But Jesus exposes their hypocrisy. He exposes the fact that they like to hold other people accountable to the laws while excusing themselves. And although they like to follow laws, they've lost the spirit of love that lies behind the law of God. But the law, revealed in Exodus, becomes a cornerstone of Hebrew worship and life. In the first century context of Judaism, the law is premier. On top of that, Exodus initiates 2 other elements of Hebrew worship. It explains to the people how they are to design the tabernacle, their house of worship. Later, under Solomon, this will become a temple, a fixed structure. But the tabernacle was a tent that could be set up for worship wherever the nomadic Israelites moved. They could worship within it and then fold it up and take it to their next point on their journey. The fact that God initiated in detailed description the building of a house of worship would define how Jewish people understood worship. In the first century context of the Gospels, the Hebrew people believed that God's Spirit lived inside the temple in Jerusalem. They wouldn't have said God was everywhere. They wouldn't have said God was up in heaven. They wouldn't have said that God lives in all of our hearts. They would say, no, we know where God is. He's in the very center of the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. That's where God's Spirit resides. He lives there. When the Ark of the Covenant moves, God's Spirit moves with the Ark of the Covenant. On top of that, there's a sacrificial system that's initiated in Exodus. Exodus describes the building of the altar on which animals are to be sacrificed. And the following book, Leviticus, describes the sacrifices that are supposed to be offered. Sacrificial payment or atonement for sins becomes a cornerstone of Jewish worship. As a Jewish person, you understand that when you sin, you have rejected the creator of life. And the logical consequence for rejecting the creator of life should be death. You should have to die for rejecting God, for breaking any of God's laws. But the sacrificial system allows Jewish people to take one of the best animals from their herds and go to the temple and offer it on the altar as a sacrifice. And that animal becomes a graphic object lesson of God's punishment for sin. The animal dies in place of the person who sins. And then the person is forgiven and freed to go back and live again according to the dictates of the law as best they could. So Jesus, as a young boy, would have gone to the temple with his family on the high holidays to do things like offer sacrifices in the temple. When the New Testament refers to Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, it's drawing on the sacrificial teachings set up in Exodus and Leviticus and saying that Jesus ultimately fulfills the sacrifice that the Hebrew people were called to. So that's the book of Exodus. It sets up the law, the sacrificial system to compensate for breaking of the law, and the temple, which was designed to house God and create a place where sacrifices could be altered. That then is the heart of Jewish worship. The context of Jesus and the Gospels was defined by this probably 1,500-year-old tradition recorded in their scriptures and preserved in their culture. The rest of the story of the Hebrew scriptures then captures what happened to the Jewish people, the chosen people, the descendants of Abraham, as they sought to live according to the law of Moses. You see them finally in the reign of David securing a homeland, and this is to be their nation. This is the heart of Israel's history, the Golden Age. David was the best king they had ever had, and they never expected anyone better than David to come along. They hoped for descendants in the line of David to sit on the throne and continue to rule over Israel, to make sure that it was a strong monarchy with walls around the city and armies to protect it. They anticipated that God's peace would reign on the earth through Israel. David was the peak of Israel's history. So in the life of Jesus, in the Gospels, in the first century context, the expectation is that a Messiah will come in the bloodline of David and rule like David over Israel, be a great king, and set the people free from Rome, which ruled over them in the first century. So the entire context of the Gospels is set up by this probably 1,500-year history of being chosen as a descendant of Abraham, being called to be faithful to the law of Moses and offer sacrifices when one fails to follow the law, and then to live in the anticipation that Israel will have a nation, a land to call its own, on which it will place all of its hope for its future. So as Jesus walks the earth, he begins his ministry by saying, "Repent, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near." And all the people in the first century world would have heard that in the context of the Hebrew scriptures. That's exactly what we want. We want the kingdom of heaven, a literal kingdom in which a king rules over a nation on the earth and protects it and chases away all the bad guys, all the nations around them. They are anticipating a sovereign nation on the earth. Now, when Jesus uses the word kingdom, he means it in a different way. The kingdom of God to Jesus is not a conquering kingdom. It's a kingdom that will actually surrender itself to the point of dying on the cross. But the context of the first century world would define how Jewish people heard the teachings of Jesus. And that confusion between what Jesus meant and the context in which they heard it creates some fascinating and ironic disconnects between Jesus and his listeners. So all that to say, the first century context of the Gospels is primarily defined by the Hebrew histories, the stories of the Hebrew people that had led up to the moment of Jesus' life. The second context in which the New Testament is set, in which the Gospels were written, is the Greek context. And you have to understand a good deal about Greek to understand the New Testament, if for no other reason than that the New Testament is written in Greek. But the reason it's written in Greek comes from an interesting history. About 300 years before Jesus, there was a guy named Alexander the Great who went around conquering the world. And he was a Greek, and so after he conquered the world, he converted the world into using the Greek language for its trade. It became the dominant language of the European world in its day. He died in about 323, is actually a very young man. He only lived into his 30s. With the conquest of the Greek language came the conquest of Greek concepts, because our thoughts, our ideas are contained by the words that we use. And if you don't have a word for it, it's hard to think it. So Greek, in spreading its language all over the European world, spread the history and values of Greece all over the world. So you have to understand a little of the values of Greece to understand the values that existed in the time of Jesus. Let's go back a little bit before Alexander. There was a great philosopher in the history of Greece known as Socrates. And Socrates used to wander around Athens, Greece, barefoot in the snow and talking to people about ideas. Socrates said that the unexamined life is worth living, and he spent his life examining life and talking about what was valuable, what was good, what was true, and what was beautiful. He gathered around him a group of young men who would watch him engage in debates with people of his day who seemed important. He liked to engage with teachers or politicians who thought highly of themselves. And he would engage them in conversation in which he began to ask them questions. And the questions presumed the position of someone who didn't know anything and just wanted to know more by asking questions. But what Socrates would do would be to engage people, requiring them to define the concepts that they were using. And he seems to have caught on to the idea that all concepts have fuzzy borders. In other words, when you try to define something like love, there are certain cases which become very ambiguous because it's not clear if they fit in the category of love or not. Or consider a concept like beauty or truth. It's hard to rigidly define what is beautiful or true. When he got in debates about ethics, about what is good and bad, it suddenly became very clear that not everyone has an objective sense for where their ideas of good and bad come from. So Socrates would ask people questions about what they believed. And through the course of asking them questions, he would eventually lead them to contradictions. He would lead them to the point where they contradicted themselves. And thus they would be a little bit embarrassed and a little bit flustered, and they would go back and try to redefine their terms again so as to include the embarrassing hypocrisy, or to escape the embarrassing hypocrisy that Socrates had revealed. Well, of course, it became clear before too long that Socrates knew exactly what he was doing and was simply trying to make important people look bad. The young men of Greece thought this was hilarious and became disciples of Socrates and followed him everywhere. But the teachers of the day were offended by him and ultimately sought to have him removed from Greek society. They charged him with corrupting the youth and brought him up on trial. In ancient Athenian society, the way the court system worked was you would be charged, and if found guilty, you were given a severe penalty. But you could then propose an alternative penalty that wasn't as bad as the one the court decided on. And maybe they would be lenient and give you the lesser punishment that you yourself suggested. So they brought Socrates up on charges of corrupting the youth. He himself said, I was merely trying to ask questions to find out what's true. They were not impressed with this answer, and they sentenced him to death. He was given the alternative of offering a lesser punishment of his own. And so he did. He said, well, since I've spent so much time educating the young men of Athens, you should give me a salary and a place to live for free, and the government should pay for it. Perceiving this as sarcasm, they sentenced him to death. They put him in prison, and the final conversation he had with a friend was one in which the friend tried to convince him to escape prison and run away. But Socrates said the state had always been faithful to him, and so he saw no reason to be disobedient. And he then drank the poison that was delivered to him by the jailer, and he died. The first great martyr of philosophy. And that's the story of Socrates. And Socrates is often seen as the father of philosophy. There were pre-Socratic philosophers. There were people who speculated about the nature of the world before Socrates. But Socrates achieved a kind of fame that the rest didn't. And that's because Socrates' story was captured by one of his students, a guy named Plato. And Plato wrote a series of dialogues, which to this day are brilliant reading. If you've never read one of the dialogues of Plato, you should read one of the dialogues of Plato. Read the Euthyphro or the Crito. These powerful narratives in which Socrates is the main character and enters into a dialogue with another person of his day, another Greek, and they try to analyze concepts as Socrates asks him questions. Plato, we know nothing from Socrates' own mouth, and we don't know if Plato's presentation of Socrates is all Socrates or all Plato or a combination thereof. But Socrates became famous because Plato captured his story. Plato, then, a disciple of Socrates, taught philosophy primarily through the lens of these dialogues. And Plato attempted to teach philosophy in subjects of politics, ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics. His most famous work is probably The Republic, in which he talks about what the state, how the state should be governed. And this interweaves with some recommendations in terms of human life and daily life and how people should function. But Socrates and then Plato envisioned a government that was ruled over by a wise philosopher king, someone who is well schooled in philosophy so that they could make wise decisions and rule the people wisely, and thus wisdom would bless humanity. Well, Plato started a school in Athens and gathered around him a group of young men who were his disciples. And perhaps the most important and noted of those was Aristotle. If anyone studies philosophy for the last 2,000 years, down to the modern day, you're going to study Plato and you're going to study Aristotle. Aristotle wrote a number of works, and unlike Plato, did not write them in the form of dialogues. He wrote them in the form of studies, analysis. He wrote a book called The Rhetoric, in which he studied how speech works, because the pinnacle of Greek society was to become an effective and important orator and senator and leader of the people. He wrote a book about ethics called the Nicomachean Ethics, in which he talks about what right and wrong are and how to discern right and wrong and how to live according to the virtues. Aristotle primarily carries on the tradition of Plato, but Aristotle disagreed with Plato in an important and fundamental way. Plato believed that the universe was grounded in a universal norm called the forms. The forms were a perfect version of any given concept. So for instance, there's a perfect version of a chair. And all the chairs we see in the world are shadows of the perfect idea, the perfect concept of a chair. Or in more complex ways, there's a perfect idea of truth or beauty or love. And all the manifestations we see in the world are lesser versions or shadows of the form of truth or beauty or love. Plato said the forms dictate how the world looks. Aristotle would disagree, and this was Aristotle's great heresy. Aristotle would say what we have is what we see in the world. There are no forms behind it. We simply have a multitude of different things that we experience and take in. But any general concepts that we have because we've looked at the specifics of the world and sort of globbed them together in our minds. But there are no universal forms that shape the particulars of this world. The particulars are all there are. If you look at the painting of the School of Athens by the Renaissance painter Raphael, you see a painting of all the philosophers gathered on the steps of the School of Athens. And in the middle, Plato and Aristotle are disagreeing with one another. Plato has one index finger pointing upwards, as though as to insist that there is a universal form that governs the world, a universal logos that governs the world. And Aristotle has his fingers pointed down as if to say the particulars are all we have in the world. The specifics of this world are all we have. Well, Aristotle continued the tradition of mentoring young men, as had Plato and Socrates. And in so doing, he took in as one of his students a young man named Alexander. Alexander, the son of Philip of Macedon and Olympia. Alexander, from a young age, had a sort of a domineering personality and set out to become the philosopher king that Plato and Aristotle said the world needed. But unfortunately, in seeking to become the philosopher king, decided that conquest was what kings pursued. And he conquered all the world he could get his hands on, largely by warfare and slaughter. He died in his 30s, the legend being that he wept for there were no more worlds left to conquer. So Alexander then has stretched his empire from as far north as what we'd call England to as far west as what we now call the Middle East. And in doing so, he spread the Greek language and the Greek culture all over what we now know as Europe. Greek became the dominant language of trade in that part of the world. Just as English today is largely the language of trade. People all over the world learn English because America is the richest country in the world. A few centuries ago, everybody learned French because French was the predominant language of trade throughout the world. Throughout history, one language or another has largely dominated, if not the entire world, then a large region of the world. And for the Middle Ages, the Greco-Roman world would dominate language. The New Testament then would be written in Greek, because as the disciples of Jesus sought to make the message of Jesus known widely, they knew Greek was the language of trade. And if they wrote their letters in Greek, the broader world could read them. And so the New Testament, as we read it, is written in Greek. Greek philosophy shaped Greek language, and so the Greek New Testament contains concepts that are fundamentally Greek. When the Gospel of John, chapter 1, begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. The Greek word that we translate word in English is the word logos. And from logos, we get the word logic. But logos is bigger than logic. It's not just reason, and it's not particularly well translated word. In the beginning was the concept. In the beginning was the foundation of all reason. That's how that text should be translated. In the beginning was the foundation of all sense and order and reason. And that foundation of sense and order and reason is God, and also was with God in the beginning. Because the foundation of order and sense and reason was born as a human being, Jesus of Nazareth. John, in using the word logos, is using a word that the Greek philosophers were already using to discuss the source of order in the world. And John means to speak into their language, using a Greek concept that they already have in mind. We could go through the New Testament and look at a number of different instances where the Greek world shaped the the first century context of the Gospels. There's actually one place in the book of Acts where I believe it's Paul and Barnabas arrive in a Greek city, and they believe that Paul and Barnabas are the Greek gods Zeus and Hermes, because there was an ancient legend about how Zeus and Hermes, Zeus and another one of the gods appeared on the earth and were not welcomed, and so they destroyed a city. And that's again the Greek world interpreting the work of Jesus and his disciples. So the New Testament is shaped by Greek language and thus is shaped by Greek ideas. Later on in the first century, not later on in the early church, in the 5th century, a guy named Augustine of Hippo in North Africa, who was well schooled in Plato's philosophy, would write about Christianity largely from the mindset of a Greek. And forever after, Christian theology would be shaped by Augustine's interpretation of Paul. People sometimes criticize Augustine and even Paul for saying that they were reading the Greek mindset into the world of Jesus. But in fact, I would say they're inextricably interwoven. Jesus lived in a Greek-speaking world, and the Greek mindset shaped his context. The third context that we have to understand when we read the Gospels is the context of the Roman Empire. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and began an attack on the prevailing powers that left him the emperor over what used to be a republic. This was a fundamental transformation in the history of Rome. Rome had previously been a collection of city-states that was attempting to function in some ways democratically, and Julius Caesar decided that it was going to be an empire ruled over by a king. There were actually 12 Caesars. Caesar is just a word for king, from which the Germans got the word Kaiser, which meant essentially the king of Germany or the president of Germany. But Caesar is just a title, like king or Christ. So Julius was the first of the Caesars, and the Caesars passed down their authority through, if not a direct bloodline, through adopted children. And the next Caesar would be Augustus Caesar, who was the king of the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus' birth. So he was the one who issued a decree that a census should be called, and everyone should return to their hometowns to register. This is what sent Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem for the birth of Jesus, which became the basis of our Christmas story. Augustus Caesar would die during the life of Jesus and would pass the reins on to Tiberius Caesar. And eventually under, I believe it was under Tiberius, was it under Tiberius? That Vespasian and Titus would be sent in to conquer Jerusalem in 70 AD. They were sent in 66 AD, and eventually the city fell in 70 AD. So the New Testament world is shaped by the Roman context because Rome rules over Judea in the time of Jesus. And a lot of what Jesus has to say is in one way or another related to Rome. Sometimes Jesus is asked specific questions about the rule of Rome, such as, should we pay our taxes? And Jesus says, whose face is on a denarius, on a coin? And they say, Caesar's face is on the denarius. And Jesus replies, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God. And so Jesus essentially affirms the obedience to the state of his day without leading an explicit revolution against them, though he does in fact intend to turn everyone towards the kingdom of God instead of the kingdoms of this world. As I said, Julius Caesar would go in and conquer in about 49 AD. The Greek world that Alexander had set up was not able to stand on its own because no one could wield power like Alexander could. So between his day and Caesar's day, there was sort of an unsteady, I wouldn't say an unsteady peace. There was ongoing battles and conflicts over who could control what, till eventually Julius Caesar conquered and began to make what had been the Greek world become the Roman world. In many ways, the Romans simply adopted Greek culture. In fact, they took all the Greek gods and simply changed their names. So the Roman pantheon of gods is just the Greek pantheon of gods with Latin names instead of Greek names. Uh, Zeus became Jupiter, and I don't know if I can still remember. Hermes became Ares. So if you go through, you can look at the gods and how they match up. The Romans were the ones who would name the planets, though. So we have a planet named Jupiter, who was named after the Roman king of the gods, Jupiter, which was also the god Zeus. Likewise, they named the days of the week. And so Saturn is named after a Roman god instead of a Greek god. The months of the year were named in the Roman Empire and were named after Roman figures. So Julian became out of July came out of Julian. There were Roman names that dictated the shaping of our calendar as we have it today. Although that would not happen in Jesus' day, that was a few centuries later. The Roman Empire added a level of innovation that the Greek Empire had not. Because whereas Alexander went around simply conquering everything as a warlord, the Romans tried to organize it. The Romans were master builders. They paved roads throughout the empire so as to be able to move goods and soldiers to their borders so as to conquer more lands. They would conquer a land and then run paved roads through it. This allowed the horses to draw wagons and move goods along trade routes. They also built aqueducts everywhere they went so as to move water over miles of distance, both for consumption and for farming. They were architectural masters. The Colosseum that still stands in Rome was a construction of the ancient Roman world. They built theaters like that all over the place. There's a great theater that still stands in Ephesus, which appears in the New Testament. They built Caesarea Philippi, which became a marvel of their world, with architectural wonders, including at one point Caesar built a hill to himself. He wanted a palace, a summer palace on a hill, so they literally moved the dirt in order to create a mountain so that he could build a palace on top of it. And they built aqueducts that actually caused the water to run up to the top of the mountain. Today we might take that sort of thing for granted. In the ancient world, that was magic. So Rome was a master of organization. They also created a taxation system. So when they would conquer a land, they would appoint a junior king, a puppet king, to be the middle management over that land. The king's job was to keep the peace and to collect taxes. They would conscript the young men of the conquered territory into the Roman army and use those men to go and conquer the next territory so as to expand Rome. They would offer citizenship or partial citizenship for appropriate obedience to Rome. You could become a half citizen and have more rights than a conquered person who was not a citizen at all. At one point in the New Testament, you'll see the Apostle Paul appeal to his captors when he's a prisoner and say, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. And they realize that he has rights because he is a Roman citizen. The Roman world shapes the Christian church first in the day of Jesus, because the Jewish people are brewing for a rebellion. They are longing to throw over Rome. And Jesus has to speak into the world of the people who are anxious to have a Jewish Messiah cast out Herod, the Roman appointed king of the Jews, and instead become a king and dispense with Roman rule. When Jesus is placed on the cross, they'll put a crown of thorns on his head and put a sign over his head that says the King of the Jews. This is the Romans mocking him to say, we are the rulers of Judea and no one can throw us out. Little did they know the irony of their deed, that they were crucifying the King of the universe, who would come to lead a kingdom that spread across all nationalities. But in their day, they thought they were simply dismissing a rabble-rouser who wanted to undermine Roman authority. The Roman Empire would last for another 5 centuries before it would finally be conquered by the barbarian hordes from northern Europe, the Germanic tribes, the Goths and Visigoths and Ostrogoths. And in that time, in those first 5 centuries, the Christian church spread. It was in the early 4th century that Constantine forbade the persecution of Christians. Nero in 65 AD had started persecuting Christians, and Domitian had continued that persecution. And there was sporadic persecution for the first 300 years until Constantine, with what's called the Edict of Milan. He wrote a document which is actually interesting to read. It's still online. In which he says, we better not persecute the Christians anymore because who knows if their God might be right. And it's said that Constantine's mother, who had become a Christian, was a significant influence on this decision. After that, the New Testament would be translated into Latin by a guy named Jerome. And the Latin New Testament would spread throughout the European world and would dominate European life for the next 1,000 years. When Martin Luther came along and translated the Latin Bible into German, he was doing something very offensive because the Roman Catholic Church wanted to control the scriptures and wanted it only in Latin, which they considered a holy language, and it prevented the common people from reading the Bible and accessing biblical authority. All that to say, the Roman influence shaped the history of the Christian church, and it shaped the context of the New Testament, specifically the context of Jesus. Now, here's something interesting to realize about the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Roman context of the New Testament. This is a clever little metaphor that a pastor friend of mine named Earl Palmer used to use to describe how life works. He says, we move through stages of life that are contained in the contexts of the New Testament. He says the Hebrew people were primarily concerned about family. The family unit was essential to Hebrew life. You learn the scriptures at the dinner table. You were called to be a family of God, and the families within the Hebrew culture were at the heart of the Jewish life. He says all of us begin life as children in a Hebrew context of our lives. When we are children, family is what's most important. Mom and dad and brothers and sisters and home, those are what's most important. When we're children, we're not concerned yet about the big issues of life, about governance and ethics. We just want to be at peace with our family. We're growing and learning within a family context. And that's the Hebrew stage of our lives. When we become teenagers, we enter what you might call the Greek stage of our lives. Many of us in our teenage years love ideas. Teenagers read books and go to school. And you go to college and you learn more ideas and bigger ideas. And you just want to sit in a cafe all afternoon and think and talk to your friends about ideas and convince people of things and be convinced of things. And so that's the Greek stage of your life. It's the stage of ideas. Everybody is a little more inclined to one stage or another. I've always been a Greek. I love the world of ideas. But then as life goes along and you get married and you move into a home, you enter the Roman stage of your life. And the Roman stage of your life is where you're concerned about business. You're not as interested in ideas because there's a mortgage payment that has to be paid. And so you move into a stage of life where you have to take care of making sure that the roads are paved and the buildings are being built and finances are being orchestrated and taxes are being paid. And you might organize a house, but you're not doing it from the cute, cuddly seat of the child enjoying the family. You're the manager of the family, trying to make sure everything is taken care of. That's the Roman stage of your life. And then finally, in our later years, in our senior years, we become a grandparent. And we retire from the world of work. And we enter again into a Hebrew stage of life where family matters most. And grandparents just get to enjoy their grandchildren and spoil their grandchildren and invest in their grandchildren. And that is, again, the Hebrew stage of life. So you can see, if you look at the big picture of our lives, we move through the context of the New Testament, from the Hebrew to the Greek to the Roman stage, and then back to the Hebrew stage again, which is just a clever and cute way of looking at some of the influences on the New Testament from the context of our own lives. One of the most important and notorious forms of teaching, a basic foundation of critical thinking, was developed by an ancient Greek philosopher named Socrates. The story goes that another philosopher went to see the Oracle of Delphi. The Oracle of Delphi was a prophetess who claimed to speak for the god Apollo and who gave Apollo's words to the people. This philosopher went to the oracle and asked, "Is anyone in Athens wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle replied, "No." This philosopher then went out to see what it was about Socrates that made him so wise. Socrates was baffled by the oracle's teaching because Socrates said, "I don't really know anything at all." Socrates was in the habit of investigating what was really known and knowable and asking questions of teachers and public speakers known as sophists who would come to town and take large salaries teaching and tutoring other people's children. Socrates would go and investigate these teachers, ask them questions about what they actually believed. And through a process known as elenchus, which is now called which we call the Socratic Method, he would slowly expose the fact that the teachers weren't quite as sure as they thought they were about the claims they were making. The process was a fairly sophisticated one, especially because it was all done on his feet. Socrates would wander around Athens, barefoot as a matter of fact, and ask questions of people in conversation. These conversations were later captured in dialogues by his student Plato. The young men of the town would follow Socrates around because they loved watching him unmask his opponents and show that they didn't really know as much as they thought they did. Here's a little of how the Socratic method worked. In order to understand it, you have to understand two forms of logical reasoning known as Modus Ponens and Modus Tollens. I'm going to explain those briefly and then we'll come back to the story of Socrates. Modus Ponens is a logical structure of an argument that goes this way. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. In other words, premise 1, if one thing is true, then a second thing is true. Premise 2, the first thing is true. Conclusion, therefore the second thing is true. We could put it in the form of a common English conversation. If it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. It is raining outside, therefore I'll carry an umbrella. That structure is called Modus Ponens. Keep that one in mind for what comes next. The second logical form we need to know is called Modus Tollens. Modus Tollens is similar, but not the same. It goes this way. If P, then Q. Not Q, therefore not P. Or in other words, premise 1, if one thing is true, then a second thing is true. But premise 2, the second thing is not true. Therefore, conclusion, the first thing was not true. Again, in the form of an English conversation, if it's raining outside, then I'll carry an umbrella. I'm not carrying an umbrella, therefore it's obviously not raining outside. That's called Modus Tollens. So keep that one in mind. The Socratic method uses both of these forms of logic. Socrates would go and interview people and ask them questions. The first thing he would do, the first step in the Socratic method, was to ask them what they believed was true. He'd interview them and ask them to stake a claim. Then secondly, he'd clarify it. He'd parrot back to them exactly what they had said. At which point the conversation becomes a little bit silly because all of the real dialogue is done by Socrates and the other person simply says yes and no. Socrates will then say, "So are you saying this?" And his interlocutor will say, yes, that's what I mean. So he's now clarified point A. The next step he will draw on is he'll say, "But haven't we said that if A is true, then B is true?" And the debater or the opponent will say, yes, we've said B is true. Okay, well, if A is true, then B is true, and we know that A is true, then obviously B is true as well. That's Modus Ponens. And his conversation partner will say, yes, 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 B is true as well. And then often Socrates will say, well, but if B is true, isn't it the case that C is true? And the other person will say, yes, oh Socrates, that is true as well. And Socrates will then sort of belabor the point. We know where it's going, but he'll drag it out. And he'll say, well, we've said that B is true. And so if B is true, then C is true. And B is true, then we know C is true. He's used modus ponens again. The problem is, by the time he gets to point C is something that is usually obviously false. It's often self-contradictory. And so we'll end up with the fact that C is true, but he'll point out, well, look, C obviously is not true. And now he'll use modus tollens twice and say if C is not true, then B could not have been true. And if B could not have been true, then A could not have been true. So perhaps we made a mistake somewhere along the way. And now the person he's arguing with will have to backtrack and change what they said a little bit to clarify again what they actually believe. And Socrates will do the same thing. He'll follow their train of logic and lead them in a process that Plato referred to as philosophical midwifery, where he serves like a midwife delivering a baby, except the baby is truth or philosophical reasoning, and he's helping the person walk through it through all the steps. The position that Socrates plays is a position of ignorance. It's a little bit ironic because obviously Socrates knows what he's doing and he's very clever, but he claims to be ignorant and only asking questions. He claims not to know anything himself. And a good example of this is in a dialogue that Plato wrote called the Euthyphro. In it, Socrates ends up in a conversation with a guy named Euthyphro. And Euthyphro is on his way to take his father to court. Euthyphro says that would be the pious thing to do. And Socrates then begins to interview him. He goes through the process of Elenchus, through the process of the Socratic Method. He first compliments Euthyphro, which sounds like a bit of a joke, because clearly he has in mind to undermine Euthyphro or to expose Euthyphro's ignorance, but he almost always begins by complimenting the people he's in dialogue with. Socrates will say, that's excellent, Euthyphro, but now tell me, what is piety? And Euthyphro will say, piety is anything that pleases the gods. And Socrates will clarify and say, excellent. So piety is that which the gods love, and impiety is that which the gods hate. Is that what we've said? And Euthyphro will say, yes, 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 that's what we said. He goes. And then Socrates will say, but haven't we also said that the gods get in arguments with each other? Now here, this isn't quite like strict modus ponens, because Socrates is drawing on the context of everything that's implied by Euthyphro talking about the gods. When Euthyphro talks about the gods, he's talking about the Greek gods, the Greek pantheon, and all the Greek mythology that goes along with it. And Socrates is exactly right. All the Greek legends involve the Greek gods teasing each other and cheating on each other and arguing with each other and fighting each other. And so when Euthyphro says holiness or piety is that which pleases the gods, he means all the Greek gods. And Socrates then draws on that. If you're saying the gods, then you mean the Greek gods. And we know the Greek gods disagree with each other. Yes, 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 Socrates, that's correct. Well, if the gods disagree with each other, then some of them will say a thing is holy and some will say it's unholy. And so if we say that which is holy is that which is pleasing to the gods, we end up in a situation where a thing can be both holy and unholy at the same time. Yes, yes, that sounds correct, Socrates. But now, obviously, a thing cannot be both holy and unholy. It has to be one or the other. So we ended up with not C. We end up with a negation of a conclusion that they've drawn. And Socrates will now backtrack through Modus Tollens and say, well, if we know that that's not true, then there had to be a logical error somewhere along the way. If something can't both be holy and unholy, it has to be one or the other, then maybe we erred at the beginning when we said that which is holy is that which is pleasing to the gods. And Euthyphro will then clarify and try to rehash the conversation in a new direction. Ultimately, Euthyphro will end up with a dilemma which he cannot resolve. And the question is something holy because it's pleasing to the gods, or is it pleasing to the gods because it's holy? And Euthyphro cannot solve it and marches off to take his father to court. But that's a good example of how the Socratic method works. The Socratic method accosts someone who claims to know something, and through the process merely of asking questions about what they already believe, shows that they are living in contradiction. And that leaves them with a sort of an ambiguity, a kind of doubt about whether or not they had a good solid claim to begin with. So when all this is resolved, Socrates says, perhaps the reason the oracle says that I am the wisest man in all of Greece is because I know that I know nothing. And that's one of the famous lines from Socrates. I know that I know nothing. Socrates will carry on like this for quite a bit. If you read Plato's dialogues, which remain some of the best philosophical writing in Western history, you get a feel for Socrates, his personality, and his method. Plato will carry this out most thoroughly in perhaps the Republic, where he spells out how a government should be run. And undergirding that is Plato's sense for ethics, what's right and wrong. In the end, Socrates' confrontations with the powers that be ultimately anger and frustrate the leaders of Athens. And they eventually bring Socrates up on trial with the charge of corrupting the youth and being an atheist, not respecting the gods of Greece, and leading the young men of Greece to do things that are inappropriate as they challenge and question authority. Socrates is put on trial and threatened with the death sentence. And in old Athens, the way the courts worked is that if one were given a particularly harsh sentence, one could propose as an alternative a sentence that wasn't so bad. So Socrates here had the opportunity to present a contrary punishment. He could perhaps say, instead of killing me, you should exile me to another town and I'll leave Athens for good. But, ever ironic, Socrates says, here's what I think my punishment should be. I think Athens should give me a salary and a place to live for spending all of my time educating the youth of Athens. And therefore Socrates was sentenced to death. There's another dialogue written by Plato that summarizes that last story of Socrates in prison. Someone comes to help Socrates escape, and Socrates enters into a dialogue with him about whether or not one is justified in breaking the laws of the state. And Socrates crafts an argument which is debated to this day about the fact that if the state has taken care of him, he owes the state obedience even to the point of death. And at the end, Socrates drank the poison that was given to him and died, and is now known as a martyr for philosophy. That's the Socratic method. It's a critical foundation for all critical thinking. It says that critical thinking should examine premises, should examine knowledge, and determine whether or not it's well-founded. Investigate whether or not the person who holds it has good reason for holding it, or in some way might perhaps be self-referentially inconsistent. In other words, that somewhere in their belief systems, they end up contradicting themselves. Because knowledge is so ephemeral, so hard to hold on to, it's almost always the case that no matter what a person claims to believe in, there's going to be some point of conflict or tension within their own beliefs. So the Socratic method is used to this day, even in the theses that PhD students write, to undermine the thinking of great writers and philosophers and academics. The Socratic method is an excellent teaching tool to show students how to analyze and think critically about the things they read. The Socratic method is worth It's worth your time to become familiar with the Socratic Method, and it's still worth your time to read Plato's dialogues today.